Okay, so welcome everyone to this our February meeting. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our speaker James Whiting, who's joining us today, our General Secretary. So James, you have been a drama teacher. You have taught your whole career. You're a parent, you're a governor, and in the past you've been an Ofsted inspector. And and you're here today to talk to us, to give us a national perspective on the policies and priorities for the Socialist Education Association. So welcome, James, our General Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. I'm going to try and share my screen, so let's see what happens. I've got to. Has that worked? You got that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. First of all, before I sort of fully start, an apology in a sense. This is quite school-based, but not totally. But there are implications to the rest of the sector, but for the education across the board. But what I'm focusing on is a little bit school-based, because I think that's possibly the main focus of the Tories at the moment. It's branching out more, but I think that their main focus is on schools, and that's really what I want to do. Is I want to start with is what we're up against, because I think to understand how the SEA can play a role, we have to understand what is going on currently in education. So I don't know if any of you know or can possibly guess what this is from. It says all life depends upon passing exams. If you fail at football, etc., if you fail in business, exams measure people against standards. So we need an education system where people really need to understand the realities of adult life and understand what failure is about. Anyone, any idea? It's the Black Papers in 1969. Another one, a feeling for social justice, stupid. This is what happened when Dyson, one of the Black Paper authors, commented on a local authority who decided not to publish the names of pupils who'd failed exams. A feeling for social justice, stupid children after all can't help being stupid. It's no credit to clever children that they were born with no brains. I cannot help wondering whether inferior pupils benefit in afterlife and such early, etc., etc. Now, I think we can trace the Goebbelian ideology all the way back to the Black Papers, clearly, and probably before then too. But their main purpose was to undermine the comprehensive education programme that Labour was putting into place at the time and never finished. So that particular battle over comprehensive education was largely parked. What Gove realised he could do, I think, was to take over the whole system by undertaking an assault on its 6 main foundations, which are the curriculum, assessment, pedagogy, behaviour, school structures, and accountability. And the Tories installed Nick Gibb, who's only just resigned, but was in post for about, not signed, was sacked actually, or moved. But he was in post for an unprecedented 12 years. He was like the kind of general on the ground pushing the agenda. And who was the battle against? The battle against was something he called the blob. And I think in many ways, you know, the blob includes us, it includes the centre right, it includes the centre left, it includes a whole amalgam of people who have been kind of battling amongst themselves some of the time, but don't have a very clear agenda and don't have that connection to politicians, which the right of the Tory party has in terms of their education agenda. They have people advocating it in Parliament all the time. Labour and the left doesn't. So we've got, so in a sense, you know, the name the blob is not an inappropriate name, but that's who it's up against. And most academies and progressives operate in a bubble where education theory is discussed. I went to a meeting with Peter Hyman and Guy Claxton around assessment and how wonderful it would be if, you know, we could have these kind of online folders of work which pupils could take to their job interviews, etc., etc. The point is that they can wonder about that and they can put forward those kind of exciting and innovative ideas, but the Tories are deaf. They're not going to implement them. For them, life is exams, and we need a political agenda and a political push, not just thinking about progressive education in a bubble, which is a lot of what the Blob Up are doing. So why are they pursuing this agenda when a lot of the centre right, like the CBI, Kenneth Baker, I call him centre right nowadays, are not very keen on what is going on. And I think it's a very crude political initiative based on a very pernicious right-wing ideology. Now, this slide at the moment is showing you, sorry, I went on to it a little bit quickly before I finished talking, but you can see there, this is from a piece of research that in 2018 about the Conservative loss of political ascendancy. What is the reason why the Tories seem to be fading out? Well, they don't seem to be now, do they? But this was before Boris finally won. But the average age of Labour voters is decreasing. The average age of Tory voters is rising. And so the calculation is that they're relying on an increasingly small committed group. Educated people are less likely to vote Tory, support Brexit, etc. So if you look at the education age comparison, younger people, as a result, let's be frank, as a result of a lot of the reforms that New Labour made, increasing participation post-16 and increasing access to higher education, you have a much more educated group in the younger generation than you do in the old. I mean, I'm over 65, and I was quite shocked by those figures, to be honest, but there are still over 50% of my cohort of people going through education who actually didn't get any qualifications. And the numbers of people who've got degrees is much smaller as a percentage than the younger group. So the Tories are obviously worried by this. And this is S. McVeigh in I think the same kind of time, 2019. I think left-wing bias is to be removed from the whole education system because it's causing, in their view, and we've seen it again just recently with the guidance on political, you know, on how to deal with controversial topics. It keeps coming up. So their National Education Service plan is this. We've got a curriculum which is monocultural, knowledge-rich, which downgrades practical and vocational subjects. The role of the pupil is to receive knowledge, not contribute, and disadvantaged kids must be given stuffed with this stuff they call cultural capital to kind of narrow the gap between them. Of course, they're never going to narrow a gap where people from private schools, etc., are coming into education already with huge of this particular kind of cultural capital. So going on to accountability, you've got Ofsted, and I'm happy to answer any questions about Ofsted, but I'm not going to talk about it in terms of my own experience here. But the education police, if you like, what they're doing is ensuring that this knowledge-based curriculum now, this is since the framework has changed, where progress is defined as knowing more and remembering more, and teaching is about getting this knowledge across and making sure it's retained. We've got more and more behavior systems around the kind of zero tolerance model, strict uniforms. We have assessment going back to black papers, all or nothing, exam assessment. Grades are rationed, so the attainment gap can never be closed. It's quite simple if you've got norm referenced assessment. There will always be a gap in between working class disadvantaged kids and others. So pedagogy, now this is the most, I think that this is the one they have been after for a very long time, and they're starting to get this on their ground, if you like. They've been ages trying to work out a way of, without laying down the law on how teachers will teach. Gove had a battle with Ofsted about this when he first came into power as Education Secretary. They left it as a kind of stalemate where Ofsted said they wouldn't judge style of teaching. But now they've taken over through the MATs, as you'll see in a minute, the kind of the early career framework, which very explicitly lays down what teaching is about. It's about subject knowledge, it's about getting across that subject knowledge, it's about ensuring it's retained and ensuring it's retrieved properly. An interesting point on that, there's one point in the early career framework says you can't be critical until you've got the knowledge. I think that probably, if you think about that statement, that sums up in a way the difference. If you come to education, or if you come to an idea or an initiative with a critical point of view, for example, you see a load of homeless people on the streets, you start wondering, there's something wrong with society to allow this to happen. Let's go and find out why. So you start with a critical perspective, and then you tend to build the knowledge around it. But no, that is not what education for Tories is about. You get blasted with a load of facts, and when you've learned them, you can then start to work out whether you want to be critical or not. So school structures, arm length, called MATs now, which are increasing in their power, and making money becoming kind of edu businesses, making money out of curriculum materials and associated things, are raising money. I mean, Harris Academy has got from their sponsors and donations a kind of around some astonishing figure, I think it was 3 million in a year to play around with. So what they're actually doing, they're linked to the private sector. They're putting themselves in stronger positions to kind of bolster their supposed success. So now this is really for up to you. This is my opinion about where we are with this. If the Govian agenda is about taking the system over, where are we in each of those 6 pillars? And this is just my guess, my estimate. School structures, we're not all the way there yet with school structures. So I think there's about 75% of schools in our academies, and not all are members of MATs. I think around half are of the academies, so they want to push that further. Curriculum, I think we're nearly there, nearly up to 100% of what they want. I think the interesting bit, which they can't quite get their heads around, is the bit about equalities and stuff. It's something they know they've got to deal with, and they know they have this British values about respect and tolerance and all this stuff. But the curriculum, they don't really know how far to go with that. And there is a bit of a fight back, I think, which they find very difficult to deal with on that agenda, particularly under the Black Lives Matter agenda, for example, where my own local authority, which is not particularly radical left, but they put together a kind of equalities curriculum for schools, as has Hackney down the road as well. So that is going on. Assessment, I think they're 100% there. I think they've got exactly what they want. They've got a system with sorting the sheep from goats. I think they've prioritized academic education in their assessment as opposed to vocational and other forms of education. And now they're in a position where they've got this very harsh kind of linear exam regime without any kind of bending. So I think they've probably made it. Behavior, pretty on the way there. Pedagogy, just beginning. It's just beginning now with the new, with taking over the teacher training from universities if they can, by getting MATs to deliver it, by making it mechanistic. They are starting to influence that, but have got some way to go. So the SEA made structures the priority, the Give Us Back Our Schools campaign in this. Well, it's not that we're not covering the other issues at all. There's so much to do. We've got, as I said, we've got a curriculum working group, and we're almost at the point where we can kind of come up with a curriculum statement. It's quite good. It's been a lot of discussion and debate around that. And we have other policies around inspection and Ofsted. The one thing I forgot there actually was accountability, and I will just say a bit about that because it should be on there. It's hiding behind my display view, that's why. But accountability, they're almost there as well, I think, with what they want. I think the only gap is around the personal development bit around the Ofsted framework, again, which alludes to equalities and respect and for other cultures and all this sort of stuff. And again, how they implement that, and it's a bit of a contradiction with the rest of their agenda. But I think they're, you know, the league tables, the way Ofsted are policing the new curriculum and insisting on the curriculum being transmitted, if you like, to pupils is working from their point of view. So why the SEA made structures a priority? Well, first of all, no one else is making it a priority. And I include the trade unions in that. I think the NEU has sort of backed off a little bit on you know, I can understand why. We've got a situation where a lot of members now for teaching unions and education unions are working in multi-academy trusts. But I don't think that's a reason to drop it. The RMT, for example, has always campaigned against rail privatisation in a big way, whilst representing members working in private sector franchises. So I don't think it's a contradiction, and I think it's something that needs to move up the agenda, in my view, with teaching trade unions. Because without democratic control of schools, there can be no fundamental change. We can't tackle the other issues around pedagogy and around assessment and around the curriculum if we don't have proper democratic control locally. We've got to move, and because MATs and their CEOs are the new blob, they now run the system. And that is why it's very difficult to make changes apart from in the odd school or in the odd little initiative without them being on board, and they won't be. As you know, they're not inspected by Ofsted. These are just some of the ideas that around multi-academy trusts. They're totally unaccountable, and they're beginning to run their own CPD and now increasing the initial teacher training. But look at the connections. You start with Ofsted, and a lot of this agenda for the knowledge-rich curriculum and the framework, the new Ofsted framework, is at her behest. She came from ARC Academies, and she's not a teacher. On the advisory group on the new framework, we've got Ian Balcombe, we've got Steve Council, who was at 10X Academies, now Ofqual, as you can see at the bottom there. We've got Rachel D'Souza, new Children's Commissioner. We've got people on the advisory group for COVID recovery. We've got them on advisory groups for every aspect of what Ofsted does. If you look at what Warwick Mansell has said around how MAT leaders are now dominating every kind of government working party and every kind of government group. And you can't, and there's only a couple of academics like Tim Oates and lady from Sam Twistleton and from Sheffield Hallam, who can be relied on to toe the kind of right-wing line. They've been allowed onto these working groups. So the rest of the academic community in education has been totally shut out. So they're a kind of nightmare version of what LEAs used to be. They're not democratically accountable. They often have ideological views. They refuse to take part in local initiatives. So our main focus has been on Give Us Back Our Schools. It's not the only focus, but it's been the main one. And we've got, at the moment, Labour conference policy does support it because we managed to push a motion through conference. It hasn't been changed. So it is actually Labour policy, although I don't think Bridget Phillipson will recognise it as such. But that's how it is at the moment. So the way to create a new locally accountable national education service, we've got to reverse the Academies programme. And we believe make local authorities default providers, not MATs, defend the Labour conference policy and work on ways of democratic, because I think the way we've got to sell this agenda is not just about going back to the past. but reinventing the past in a way that is far more democratic and in which is far more involves stakeholders, far more staff, parents and pupils too, in the running of their schools and in the running of their local community provision, because it's not just about schools, individual schools, it's about the whole community. So the role of the SEA overall, we've got to try and influence Labour policy. We still do that. We do make, when we're allowed to, we go to the MPF and make presentations. When we try and influence and speak to and regularly contact the front bench, whoever they are, we want to work with education unions. There's a lot of union activists and officers. There's a lot of crossover in the SEA, and that's really useful on both policy development and campaigning. We want to campaign for agreed policies to be implemented when the front bench aren't engaging. So we've got this kind of dual strategy. We influence, and when they're interested in, for example, reforming inspection, we'll give them our view on that and try and help them come up with ideas. But when they're being deaf, like they are on structures, we'll campaign to get that changed. Develop policy across those 6 areas. We've got a curriculum group working at the moment. We've got an HE group and beyond those areas as well. The HE group, we've got a new, Anya's leading a new FE group, which is great. So, it's really hard to tackle everything with the size of the active membership we have. But anybody who's interested in taking on any of the areas that I've outlined with another group or a group of people who come up with more policy, be very welcome. I want to make, I know this is a bit bizarre, but I want to make the SEA the new left Nick Gibb. I become the political driver for progressive education policies. There's a lot of comrades on the left. You look at what the campaign group are doing at the moment. Understandably, they're focusing on the NHS and the privatisation in the NHS. We're trying to work with the SHA actually at the moment on a common conference resolution to kind of make these parallels between the NHS and the education service to kind of drive a kind of common perspective. But we've got to convince comrades on the left about the importance of education and the importance of taking a view on a lot of the stuff that the Tories are doing, which the left often doesn't want to, who are not involved, don't want to take a view on. Because education, we all know, with the poverty and everything, can't transform society on its own, but society cannot be transformed without education. I'll stop there.
That's great, James. Thank you. I'm sure we've got some questions for you.
Yeah, I'll just stop this in. Oh, got Panita there.
Ian. Ian, do you want to unmute?
Can't hear you, Ian. You need to unmute, yeah.
You should be able to hear me now.
I can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Can I say that's thank you to James. That's the one of the most fascinating and interesting presentations I've seen on education. In fact, on anything, to be perfectly frank. The sad thing is, I think I've known for a long time what you're saying is what we need to be doing, but we aren't there, as you've amply demonstrated. I know we've got Bridget Phillipson coming to a special meeting quite soon, but she's only here for an hour, and we've got to put questions in advance. I suggest we send your presentation to her in advance of her meeting. Perhaps you might learn something from it. But my question. My question is, I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days. My question is, under a future Labour government, do you think it will be compulsory, James, to have Union Jacks in every classroom?
No, but I understand where you're coming from. I think the kind of culture war stance of the current leadership is very, very disturbing. And I think actually it's even, I mean, I could look back, if you check out there's one bit of the Ofsted framework, the new one that's still in there, which is a little bit progressive. And if you look at the bit about personal development of pupils in the framework, you will see phrases like respect, celebrating other cultures, that it's actually a British value, in inverted commas, to do these things, although actually there's no record of that being the case in British history, but there you go. So we have got something to start with, and I think the pressures on STAMA from within ourselves, from within other communities as well, who will be pushing for change in the curriculum in a big way. Actually, I think when you take the kind of stopper off the bottle, if you like, everything will go. I mean, I think loads of demands will come from a range of groups, including people like the CBI, including different communities, including the whole green agenda, and all these things will be pushed to the front. It'll be difficult for STAMA to resist it, I think, particularly if we're strong in putting it across. But I understand where you're coming from. There's some quite worrying kind of messaging at the moment. And I mean, even the Tories don't want to, you haven't said we should have a Union Jack in every school. Mind you, Pimlico did it. I don't know if you read about what happened there, but the pupils won there, actually. The Futures Academy Trust, which is probably the most right-wing of them all, with Lord, I can't remember his name now without looking up. It's run by a Tory Lord, and they went into Pimlico and they whitewashed the walls, literally, painting over Tammy Abrahams, who was, as you know, a Chelsea striker, one of their alumni. They put Union Jacks in the playground. They tried to force kind of Black history off the curriculum. But the kids rebelled. Great, really good, and some of the staff too. And they had to drop a lot of it. So I think there's tensions out there that we can build on, and struggles we can kind of coordinate to push for that.
Paul, you've got a question, haven't you?
Yeah, mine's it's a two-part question. So firstly, obviously the Tories have incredibly politicized education and are intervening. We saw them, you know, do some really bizarre things, like for the Prevent agenda, for example. They put out right-wing symbols, which were things like swastikas, and then put out left-wing symbols, which were things like putting a swastika in the bin, and St. Pauli Football Club and Greenpeace, and all these things that you think, well, they're very benign, and that's very the opposite of benign. So I guess you know, it's how do we change the public perception around how politicized they make it, because we often say in the media things like this is a left-wing agenda and everyone in schools are lefties, but actually the political agenda of the Conservative Party is like damaging education so much. So how do we go about that? And obviously we try to do that in SEA North by putting out our talks on YouTube, for example. But are people like, how can we reach a wider audience with that? How can we bring that to parents' attention and so on? And the other thing is, I don't think you mentioned regional school commissioners, which just seem to appear out of nowhere, and became these, like, just to try to academize everything, this really highly paid role that nobody knows, that seem to be, again, politically appointed roles. And I wondered if there's any, like, if you see any way of using that against the government agenda by maybe pushing for them to be elected roles. If they're going to be hugely political roles, why shouldn't they be elected, like police and crime commissioners? And therefore you might see a different political outlook in an area, and you might see, well, rather than academizing everything, maybe you'd look at bringing back local authority maths, for want of a better word.
Right, okay, just on the regional schools commissioners, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think in terms of their kind of role, but their role is really to, at the moment, is to try and push the academisation agenda and try and get more schools into maths. And when they get a chance to do that, when a school becomes RI too often, or when it's failing its inspection, then they then try and broker deals with a particular mat around a school. I don't think their role, I think their role is just very much part of the system. I think if you had elected, I don't think you could stand really for election and say, you'd have to stand and say, well, I'm not going to academize any more schools. And I don't think the Tories would allow that, because that's not what the role is. The role is partly to implement government policy that's already been agreed, and they don't want any challenge to it. And I think that's part of the reason why local authorities are kind of withering on the vine, because there is some opposition or some challenge coming from local authorities around some of these issues. As for, I agree, and I think this is something we've really got to work on about your first question, Paul, around reaching out. We don't, you know, I find reaching out even to MPs who are not linked to education difficult enough. To be honest, they've got very glib views around education, and they don't really see it as, a lot of them don't really see it as a priority. So there's that job to be done. There's certainly parents. Now I know in Manchester we've got a comrade who's working hard to set up a kind of progressive parental alliance. I think he's got a hard job. There's Case there, but Case seems to be like quite old membership now, and came out of the comprehensive movement really. And we've got Rescue Our Schools, which is NEU funded, but says quite a lot of good things. But there's no kind of, it's really difficult to try and work out a way of how to get to parents. And I think a lot of it will come as well as part of, as agendas, you know, that they can't get it all their own way. They'll try and impose what they want, but things will always get in the way. Things always bubble up. The struggles from underneath will come. And I think one of them is going to be the green agenda. And I think that is perhaps where parents, particularly you know, more progressive parents, will want to see something happening. And maybe that's a way, and finding one of those issues and fighting that through the curriculum and through education. After all, at the moment, solutions are out. According, that's what they're saying on green education. They can learn the science, but they're not to discuss solutions because it might be too political. I mean, that's just terrible. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Anita, are you ready to unmute? Thank you.
Hello. Hi, James.
Hi, Panita.
Hi, good to see you here. Yes, so my question is really based on what you probably covered all of this, which is that the Thatcher wanted a revolution of controlling schools from the centre of Whitehall, and she wanted to privatise it, as we all know. And then we got Tony Blair with education, education, education mantra, which was kind of captured the imagination, or so it seemed, and that led to huge marketisation of higher education, and even before him, marketisation of colleges, and then finishing that so-called counter-revolution to comprehensive system, schools marketisation, which is where we are now. So in order to, and I know that the focus of the SEA rightly is about structures, and you talked about pedagogy and curriculum. But my question is, given that we had that freshness, or at least perceived freshness around labour, around education, 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 and that's led to the kind of demise in a way, and privatisation, wholesale privatisation. You know, what are the three things maybe that you think we can focus on to unravel that? You know, what are the three things, or even one thing that we could do which would come across as fresh, not just to the members of the public, but generally in terms of policy, that might capture the imagination and challenge the status quo? So that's really my question. I know it's a hard question, but I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I think that's a very good question. Just to go back a little bit on the Blair record. They went through a kind of period of trying to, you know, the target setting and the levers to try and raise achievement in schools. So I've got a dog just walked in, and they then, that wasn't working, so they went for a more marketized approach. But there was, I think we have to need to go back to some of the things they did a bit under the radar. Actually, they had a very clear agenda of increasing participation post 16 in LHE, and that did deliver. So I'm not going to take that away from them. I mean, I think it came with issues, but that did happen. There was a lot of things they didn't do well, and you're right. The academy, the beginning of academies, or certainly the second stage of academies, and the marketisation that you talked about are right. But how do we introduce a new element? I think the new element, and I would hope, and I know your role as SHA as well, because I hope that this would come into the agenda for the health service as well. I think it's about giving people more say over what is going on in schools. And I think that's from the very, you know, I don't know how you encapsulate that with a political slogan, but I think somebody could come up with one. We're talking at the moment about a totally unaccountable system where parents who try to complain, say, about what's going on in an academy, find it's just referred back to the mat to sort out. There's no accountability there at all. There's no way that they can have a voice over what is going on in schools. And for a lot of people, I think they just accept it or put their hands up or think that that's the way it is. But I think giving people back a voice is really important. And I think, because I think that, you know, we all suffered under the old sort of LA system with a little bit of that, of ignoring some of those voices. Now, I include teachers on the ground and other education workers in that. I'm not, their voice is crucial. I'm including parents' voices, pupils' voices, and students' voices. They all need to be heard. And we also need to, we need to think about education for the whole community and being delivered by that community, if you like, by that area, not just individual schools, because I think the kind of public school system that was the, you know, the model for English schooling is the wrong one. And if you look at other jurisdictions across the world, this idea of the all-powerful head teacher and the kind of individual school competing in a marketplace is not the one that most of the world follow. You want a planned system whereby education, where you work democratically through the process, where you serve the community through a different range of schools, colleges, HE, and the rest of it. So I think it's shifting the focus, but it's giving people back a voice would be the policy that I'd go for as to make a difference.
Thank you. Eileen, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, James. Absolutely brilliantly informative presentation. I think I learned massive amounts there. My question really was a bit like Panita's, and it was just to ask for advice on prioritizing strategy, because there just seems to be so much wrong, you know, and where do we focus our energies? And it was also about looking back at the information you gave us about how far the Tory agenda feel they're being successful. The one area they seem to be less successful, you seem to suggest, was like in the idea of thinking about training. They haven't quite yet managed to wipe out university trainings, but schemes, but most training is on the job in schools now under the remit of maths and so on. So I'm just trying to think of areas where we could focus, where there's still room for a fight back. And secondly, my point was about the fact that I've got four young teachers in my immediate family in their 30s, all absolutely shattered, would agree with all of this, but just don't have the time or the energy they feel to they're just existing at the moment. So I'm kind of doing it on this sort of thing, on campaigning on their behalf. But the general idea that there's less in school is a fallacy, I would say, and I think that one of my immediate family is an NEU rep, struggling with all of that as well. Morale in school is very, very low, so it's about how to support in any way we can those people who are at the chalk face, you know, and what we can do to support and help those. And the final point was about parents. A lot of those young teachers are obviously parents as well, and widening that message, you know, that support, and thinking of strategies and ways in which we can, as a group, enlighten parents, because I don't think they're fully aware of what's going on in schools.
Yeah, that's a huge amount of things to respond to. I think it's got to be about. I think your description of what it's like to be a teacher at the moment. I think it echoes across every teacher that I hear from. Will say similar things to that, and I think it's very, very difficult for a lot of teachers who aren't particularly necessarily politically committed to be involved in their trade unions anymore, because of exactly what you said. I mean, when I first started teaching, it was you know, we used to have quite big union branch meetings. I suspect those are just run by a few activists now. Nobody has the time, and I think actually trade union structures haven't kept up with the development. So I think they're starting to change. I may be wrong with the NAS. I'm not familiar with exactly where they are with it, but I know that, you know, we need a far more schools-based grouping so that people can meet easily rather than have to drive halfway across the borough to, although of course Zoom might help with that. Maybe that will transform it, who knows. But anyway, we've got to see, I think the unions did well over the COVID pandemic, and hopefully that's raised their profile for a lot of younger teachers who may want to see that as a way of getting more involved. I still think the priority has to be structures at the moment for the reason I've given, but I think we've got to look very, very carefully at events. We're dealing with people, you know, you can't just tell people, teachers, kids or whatever, oh, you're going to do this and receive this. At some little points, people go, oh, wait a minute, that's too much, that's enough, I'm not going to do that anymore. And it comes up around a particular issue, perhaps. I was talking about the green issue earlier, but it may well be a trade union issue within an academy that sometimes makes the grade and breaks the silence. It might be the funding cuts, which I think was a very successful trade union led campaign, but managed to bring in a lot of parents who all fizzled away now, unfortunately. But there were some very active parents involved in those campaigns. I went to some meetings myself. So I think we've got to wait. The pandemic is just, you know, the pandemic is just, it's not over totally, of course, but it's sort of fading away a little bit into the distance. And as that happens, the confidence to challenge and to think about what's going on in schools will increase. And we've got to take that opportunity by doing what Paul said. And we've got to put out blogs, we've got to put out letters, we've got to put out whatever we can to enable people to see a different perspective. So yeah, I'd put structures first. So it doesn't mean we don't, if there's some huge clash about what's being taught in the curriculum and it becomes a big thing, then we should be there. We should be there and ready to jump on the right side and support the fight. But let's hope some of those issues do come up, because I don't believe personally that despite the fact that I showed that chart showing the Tories putting everything in place, they're doing it, there will be resistance. There always is resistance, because there's another way of looking at it. And it bursts out in different ways, not always predictably.
Okay, thank you. Laura's been writing in the chat, and what she said links back to something that Melissa Benn said in our meeting and has written about education being directed towards a singular type. And Laura's asking about vocational education and the way that it's regarded as something lesser, when actually it should be regarded as something that's other. And I wonder whether you've got anything to say about vocational education.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about it. And we wrote, I didn't put it in that, I did mention it, but we wrote to the School Select Committee, John Bolt and I put a thing together which around, you know, the post-16 qualification thing. I've written about it as well in the first Reimagining Education book, and also in articles as well. So I think it's again an interesting little left split sometimes, where you can find people on the left who think along the lines of that we shouldn't be denying pupils powerful academic knowledge everyone else has by sidelining them along vocational routes. I don't agree with that position at all. I think it's about who controls knowledge and who decides what is powerful and what is not, and that vocational skills and technical skills are valid forms of knowledge that should be equate to academic knowledge in my book. And I think that the Tomlinson agenda had it about right. We'd need probably to flip that a bit now, but it's certainly that is the right way forward, where you have a kind of diploma qualification in which different units of academic and or vocational courses count towards it. I don't like the idea of sidelining vocational education and having a vocational stream, which is what the T levels are going to do, where students don't have the opportunity to mix and match if they want to, because that just leads to two, and that's what the government wants. It wants to, ever since the Black Papers, it's aware of kind of, we've got an elite, they have to justify their position by being the most academic. That's how they justify it. Everyone else has to be further down the hierarchy, and that is the issue with vocational education. So yeah, I'm fully in favour of against what they're doing to level up with the elite sixth forms. Please, I mean, really, that is the worst thing they could possibly do, I think, in terms of levelling up education attainment, introducing elite sixth forms and taking away groups of pupils from existing sixth forms, colleges, etc., and then just making a little academic elite. No, that's not going to bring much joy to the economy of the Northeast, that's for sure. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, and I was just thinking about, we had a meeting back in June with Melissa, but also with Julia Falconbridge, and we talked about living and learning well. And we had a really engaging meeting a couple of months ago with Louise, who's in the SEA executive, and Amy Kilpatrick, and talking about the health and well-being of children in schools and education. So actually, if parents are aware of what is happening to young people in the education system, that we're actually facing a well-being crisis with our young people, that is an area where perhaps parents could be involved and brought in, and then they will understand the impact of structures and curriculum and accountability and what it's doing to teachers and what it's doing to our students, to our pupils and young people. Vicky.
Totally agree with that. Good point.
Hi, thanks very much for what you've been saying. I just wanted to ask two questions. The first one was, I was reading somewhere that 50% of education in this country is now private. And are they including academies in that kind of statistic? That's the first question. And then the second part of my question is one that we're all thinking about, which is, if you can't change the curriculum, then we can't change society, because it's a philosophical battle that we've got there of how they can keep control over people without having a kind of curriculum which allows questioning. And like you say, climate change might creep in, start causing a fracture of their philosophy.
Yeah, thank you. Private education, I mean, I'm not aware that it's just, I mean, I'm not sure where the figure of 50% comes from. I know that we're now in a position where 37% of primary schools are academies, and around about 80% of secondary schools are academies. And about half of the academies are in maths at the moment. So we've got a significant semi-privatized kind of grouping, huge. They're in the majority now. The private sector itself, private education, I think educates about 8 or 9% of kids, something along those lines, the actual public schools and all the rest of it. So, I mean, they've got an influence and far beyond their numbers, the private sector, obviously, and have a lot of say over what happens with qualifications, etc. But they've got a lot more independence. They use the IGCSE, for example, which is a lot easier. Well, easier in inverted commas, has different ranges of assessment, whereas state school kids are being forced to go along the lines of just exam only, and it's all wrong. I mean, but yeah. So, but curriculum and society, it's an interesting one, and it's whether, I suppose, it's how far. You know, if you're looking at it from a kind of Marxist perspective, how far the education system is an agency of social control. And it always is and always has been to a degree. That's the role it plays. But at the same time, there have always been people within it who've been challenging that and see a totally different role for the education system as some way of imparting, you know, freedom and liberty and all the rest of it, and not just that, and equality and fighting for rights across the system. So the curriculum, I think, is always going to be a compromise until we get a fundamental change in society. But I think the compromise has gone almost, as I put it, almost 90% their way. And I think where you're right, climate change and the Black lives, or the Black curriculum, with its with the new look of the British Empire, are big examples of where those kind of tensions are going to come. I think that you know, we're already seeing we can't discuss the empire. That's the new guidelines. The empires have to be seen in a balanced way. Like, invading other people's countries has got to have some positives. Yeah, that's what the Conservatives are saying at the moment. But I think if you read what those people in London anyway are doing at the moment around the Black curriculum, they want to see a recognition that it's been exploitative, that it's been a means by which the British ruling class has gained tremendous influence by doing that, exploiting things that are the Tories don't want discussed. So I think you've got I think those two areas, the climate change and the Black curriculum, are where that tension, that conflict is going to emerge in the strong. It already is emerging, but it's emerging in the strongest way.
That's great, James. Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to bring this part of the meeting to a close, and then we will continue with our AGM. Thank you very much, James, for that.
No, not at all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you. I hope to come again at some point, and I wish you all the best with your AGM. I'm going to watch Fulham on the telly. So okay.